where we're going to be talking about how to engage with different knowledges when it comes to policy design, implementation and change, and particularly Indigenous knowledges. It's also a really rare chance to have a public discussion between the Australian and New Zealand Productivity Commissions. So for both of these reasons, we are really honoured to be hosting this webinar at CSI today. I would also like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land that we are working and living on. I am coming to you from unceded Ngunnawal country. I would like to acknowledge elders past and present, and also any Indigenous people joining us today. We have a truly outstanding and interesting panel today. So joining us is Romlee Mokak, who is the Indigenous Productivity Commissioner, and a Djugun man. He has been heading up the Indigenous Evaluation Strategy for the Australian Productivity Commission, and prior to joining the Commission, he was the CEO of the Lower Chair Institute. From across the ditch, we have Ganesh Nana. Kia ora, Ganesh, and thank you for negotiating time zone differences. Ganesh is the chair of the Aotearoa Productivity Commission. Craig Ritchie is joining us from Canberra. He is an Aboriginal man from the Dunghutti and Biripi nations and CEO of AATSIS. Prior to being CEO of AATSIS, he held a range of senior roles in the Australian APS. Excuse me. And finally, we have Muriel Bandlet, who is a Yorta Yorta woman and CEO of the Victorian Aboriginal Child Care Agency, and has been CEO for 21 years, which is very impressive stamina, I think, for being a CEO. So we're going to start with a bit of a brief talk from each of our panelists about their current work and some of their perspectives on this topic. We'll then go to a panel discussion, and you can then put your questions in the chat, and we will ask some of those questions. So to kick us off, Rom, would you like to tell us about your work at the Productivity Commission?
Yeah, thanks, Gemma. Thanks for the introduction. I wanted to begin by paying my deep respect to the ancestors and elders of the country upon which I'm on today, Canberra, the lands of the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people. I am a Djugun Yawuru person. My people are from Broome in the West Kimberley, but I was also born and raised in Darwin, Larrakia country. So that was fairly important time in my life up until the age of about 17. So thanks, Gemma, Centre for Social Impact, for hosting today's conversation. I'll talk a little bit about the Productivity Commission. And as many of you may know, the Commission is the Australian Government's independent research and advisory body on a range of economic, social and environmental issues affecting the welfare of Australians. And I say may intentionally because though the Commission may be well known to some, I make no assumption that the Commission is either well known or highly valued by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people across our many nations. The Commission has a specific task of building and strengthening ongoing relationships with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people and communities for our work to have most impact. As an advisory body, the Commission's contribution hinges on the quality of advice it provides to government and on the communication of ideas and analysis. It has four main areas of work. We have inquiries and studies commissioned by government, our own self-initiated research agenda, and we have a monitoring and reporting role around government service provision, complaints for competitive neutrality as well, a small function within the Commission. In 2018, the Productivity Commission Act was amended with a role created to strengthen research and evaluation of policies and programs impacting Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. And the amended Act states that at least one commissioner must, A, have extensive skills and experience in dealing with policy policies and programs that impact on Indigenous persons. And the second part of the amendment is that person, that commissioner, have experience in dealing with one or more communities of Indigenous persons. I started the role in April of 2019, so I'm about halfway through a 5-year term. And as Gemma mentioned, prior to this, I spent 15 years heading up 2 national Black organisations, the Indigenous Doctors Association for almost a decade, and most recently the Lowitja Institute, Australia's National Institute for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Health Research. So during that time, I was aware of some of the Commission's work, specifically the reporting on Indigenous disadvantage, for example, but not necessarily its wider work program or its ways of working. And my motivation in considering the role was simply to play a part in a new way to improve outcomes for our people. The idea of bringing together the Commission's long-standing institutional reputation, its rigour, its influence, with the strength, and I emphasise strength, not the perceived deficits of Indigenous peoples and Indigenous knowledges, I believe is potentially a game changer for how we think about evidence building and policy. So as I said, my role over the past 2.5 years in the Commission has seen me work on a number of areas. The Indigenous evaluation strategy that Gemma mentioned already, and I'm happy to speak about that further into the conversation today. I convened the working group that delivered on the Overcoming Indigenous Disadvantage report. And we have new functions under the new National Agreement on Closing the Gap, a data repository, an annual data compilation report. And we will move into conducting a three-yearly review of the National Agreement into the future. My role, while primarily focused on Indigenous matters, is not solely around Indigenous matters. And I was recently working with the Chair, Michael Brennan, on the Working From Home report. Some of you might have seen a bit of coverage, a good amount of coverage on that report, given the current circumstances we're all facing. Presently, I'm working on a commission from government into Indigenous visual arts and crafts. And as I've said, we're kind of building further into the work around the National Agreement on Closing the Gap. I also provide an internal advisory, if you like, across the Commission, assisting commissioners and teams on their projects. And some of those, for example, you might be aware of national water reform, the big report on mental health, expenditure on children in the Northern Territory, which emerged out of the Royal Commission into those, initially the horrific situation of kids in Don Dale and more broadly. Resources regulation, recently a research piece on incarceration, on prisons, and some work around innovations in healthcare. Each of these areas of work have addressed matters of importance for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in some way. And many of my colleagues here have said that the conversations were not previously had and are now much more common to the extent that they are now. So I think this goes to the importance of presence, of voice, and a growing confidence in what may have been seen to be difficult conversations in the past and are now becoming more routine across the institution. So in a nutshell, the Commission is undergoing, I believe, significant change. We're enhancing our cultural capability, and in this I mean adapting our ways of thinking and working to better engage and work with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. This includes our understanding of and our responsiveness to Indigenous people, cultures, histories, knowledges, and perspectives. Without addressing these elements, I think our evidence gathering, our analysis, and potentially our policy recommendations run the risk of falling short of the mark. For the first time, the Commission's corporate plan, the current corporate plan 2021, has a composite indicator specifically covering effective engagement with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people and organisations. And we will be measured on this, and we will be held accountable on this. The indicators are the extent of participation by Aboriginal, Torres Strait Islander people and organisations, two-way exchange, and the use of relevant communications tools and approaches. So with significant...
Oh, I think you've cut out, Ron.
Yeah, not sure.
You're back.
Not sure what happened there, but with significant functions under the new National Agreement on Closing the Gap, we've got this is work for the long term, and we are actively seeking to recruit Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people into the Productivity Commission. We will improve upon our current base of 1% of the Commission staff identifying as Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander. So the change is happening, and I look forward to today's conversation. Thanks, Gemma.
Thanks, Ron. I might pass to Ganesh just as another Productivity Commission person.
Thank you. Thank you, Gemma, and thank you for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here. Kia ora from across the Tassie. My name's Ganesh, and I'm Chair of the Productivity Commission. I'm a first-generation New Zealander, born and bred here in Wellington, New Zealand, of immigrant parents. My parents came a long time ago from a place far away called India, small village of about 4 million on the outskirts of Mumbai. And they settled here, and this is where I was born and brought up, and made my life. I'm an economist by trade, and spent most of my life in the private sector, running a small business consultancy, business and economics consultancy, and was appointed chair of Productivity Commission earlier this year, and it was a big reach for me to jump the fence into the public sector. Not firstly, but I should and would like to recognise and acknowledge your elders, my elders, and our elders who have come here from many lands far away in the distant past, who have worked done the hard work and left us with these lands, which is for us to look after and pass on to future generations. In terms of Aotearoa New Zealand, I acknowledge Māori as tangata whenua, the people of the land in this part of the world, and have lots of, I suppose, respect for the challenges that they have gone through, just given all the obstacles that have been put in front of them throughout the past, I suppose, couple of 100 years of colonisation. In terms of the New Zealand Productivity Commission, we were set up about 10 years ago, modelled very much on the Australian Productivity Commission. So that one's a little bit older than us, but we were set up about 10 years ago, and I'm the first sort of new chair. The original chair lasted the first 10 years. And there's been a bit of a change in the last sort of couple of years in the commission. And I suppose for background, though, the curiosity is that we haven't had the legislative change that you indicated, Ron, just before in the Australian Commission's legislation. But one of the reasons I was agreed to pick up this challenge was to look at the original legislation for the New Zealand Productivity Commission, and I read from its purpose, which is to provide advice to government on improving productivity. And this is the one that really got me. It's the last bits of this phrase, in a way that is directed to supporting the overall well-being of New Zealanders, having regard to a wide range of communities of interest and population groups in New Zealand society. And so I took a lot out of that phrase, and definitely in the context of well-being being in the original purpose of the Commission, but also that recognition that when we can't just look at the average New Zealander, we've got to recognise the different groups within the population, the different communities that make up Aotearoa. And I think that's the challenge for us here at the Commission. We're a relatively small organisation, same as the Australian Productivity Commission in the context of providing advice, being an independent think tank. In our world, we're what's called an independent Crown entity. So we're not driven by ministerial edict, but so we've got that level of independence, but it is still up to us to convince ministers to adopt the advice or the recommendations that we might put in front of them. The core pieces of work that we've got on the go at the moment, one which I find quite, I won't say challenging, but quite ironic as a first generation New Zealander, son of an immigrant, is we've been asked to look at long-term immigration settings for New Zealand and policy recommendations about immigration. And that's, I won't say ironic, but it is interesting that we all do start from, unless we're tangata whenua, unless we're Māori, we are a nation of immigrants. And in terms of our preliminary document that we put out a couple of weeks ago, we made it quite clear that the original, for want of a better word, the original immigration document into New Zealand was indeed the 1840 Treaty of Waitangi, which was signed between the Crown and Māori, which enabled the colonisers to bring their people to these shores. And I won't call it ironic, but it's curious. Well, it's more than curious. It's quite a very bad signal, I suppose, that since that 1840 document, all of the policy documents and regulations and legislation about immigration into Aotearoa have been absent. There's been an absence of any connection to Māori or any indication that Māori would have a voice in setting immigration policy, or even any acknowledgement that Māori were there right at the very first document. So we made that quite clear, and I think that was very much I won't call it a controversial recommendation. It's still only preliminary, but the usual pushback is what's productivity got to do with the treaty, and what's productivity got to do with those sorts of things. So we're grappling with those sorts of challenges. Similar as Ron says, the world is changing, and definitely the Commission in this part of the world is changing with it. We have to change, we need to change. The other inquiry topic that we've got a couple more minutes just to point out, is an inquiry topic which is relatively new, and we're just waiting for our terms of reference to come through. But it was originally titled around economic inclusion and social mobility, which is a bit of a mouthful. So we've given it a bit of a headline about a fair chance for all. So we're interpreting it as how do we break the cycles of persistent disadvantage that many individuals and some groups and communities encounter, and whether it's specific to particular individuals or whether it's across generations. And so that's a pretty exciting piece of work from my perspective, really waiting to get my teeth into that, and as is others in my team, because it's a way of, I suppose, broadening our reach to get beyond the productivity first and we'll do well-being when we can afford it, to this idea that actually productivity and well-being go together, and it's not one before the other. We have to address them both. And actually, from my own perspective, I actually think part of our productivity problem is that we've never done well-being to start with. But I'll leave that with you. Looking forward to a good chat, and thank you for welcoming me here. Cheers.
Thanks, Ganesh. Craig, I might pass to you next.
Well, good morning, everybody. Great to be here. Dungari wai Craig Ritchie, Guri Dungari. And I'm a Dungari. My name's Craig Ritchie. I'm a Dungari man. I have connections to the Biripai people as well. Dungari country is Kempsey, around Kempsey on the mid-north coast of New South Wales. And it stretches from Walker in the New England Ranges down to the Pacific coast. I was born and grew up, however, on Gurrumburra country in central west of New South Wales, and I'm coming to you from Ngunnawal country here in Canberra, and acknowledge the Ngunnawal people and their ongoing presence and custodianship on their own country, and honour them and thank them for providing a home for this Dunghutti man and his family for the last 2 decades. IATSIS is Australia's only national Australian Institute of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Studies. It's a national institution with an exclusive focus on the history, cultures and stories of First Nations Australians. It was established in 1964, so we're 57 years old. Primarily in the framework of thinking in the 1960s about Indigenous people, primarily established to undertake research and documentation of Aboriginal culture as it was understood then, largely by non-Aboriginal people, as a disappearing culture. The idea was common at the time that we would disappear from the pages of history, which we've patently refused to do. And so our focus has shifted from that backward-looking salvage effort to research and other activities, research publication, collection management, and engagement, built around the idea that as First Nations people, we are a living, breathing, vital part of modern and contemporary Australia. And so our question is, our mission, in a sense, is to tell that story and to create opportunities for people to engage with that story, that first Australian story that is not only is it 65,000 years old, it's living and vibrant today in 2021. And at the same time, to do that on the basis of a facilitation of cultural resurgence amongst our communities and an effort to shape the story that we tell ourselves as a nation and that we tell the world as a nation. So many people are familiar with IATSIS as an archive and a collecting institution. We hold a collection now of well over 1 million items that relate to our cultures and our stories. But most importantly, those items are a material embodiment of our knowledges and our wisdom and our connection to country. And so the risk of sounding a bit Captain Kirk-like, our ongoing mission is to unpack that knowledge within a framework of Indigenous knowledge, Indigenous sovereignty, data sovereignty, knowledge sovereignty, and use that as the basis of all that we do. So I come to this webinar as an old school teacher, I used to say former, but former instead of old is getting less and less tenable as the years pass by. And then after teaching, having worked for many, many years in Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander health, both in the community-controlled sector and then in the public sector. And I come to the questions that we'll discuss today as fundamentally as a social scientist and as a public servant who is desperately interested in the practical question of how do we do better. It's been the guts of my own personal research for the last decade. It's the guts of what we do here in our research agenda. And so our research program here at IATSIS, sorry, let me just finish that question. As a social scientist, but with a background as a classicist and a historian and a history teacher, our research program focuses on national priorities, but informed by local community-led partnerships. And for the last 2 decades, IATSIS has set standards in ethical research in relation to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Code of Ethics for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander research, which was released in 2020. That's a revision, if you like, or a second edition of what used to be our guidelines, but in our national code. As I think about the issues that we're going to discuss in this webinar, I think there are a few things that are of central importance to us. The first of them is a cluster of issues that centre around the difference that comes about by making Indigenous people partners in the exercise rather than objects of the exercise, of evaluation and of research, and indeed in policy making. Which leads me to a second question. So the late Patrick Wolfe defined settler colonialism, I think rather powerfully, as a structure rather than an event. And the underpinning principle of that structure, he said, and I think rightly, was the elimination of the native. And so all of our systems, all of our structures, all of our ways of thinking in contemporary Australia, I can't speak reliably of Aotearoa, but I suspect the same, rooted as it is in the settler colonial experience, have in some way that logic of elimination embedded in them. And so we come to this question is how do we reverse that exclusion, and how do we in fact bring, I had to use this language, bring back the native. How do we bring us as First Nations people? How do we bring not just our presence in a room or sitting around a table, but the knowledge and the wisdom that we embody in doing that? How do we bring that back in to the process of analysis, the process of policy making, the process of evaluation? And related to that, the question of how do institutions change? How do institutions that have that eliminative logic built into them, how do they transform? And of course, there's a whole section, Priority Reform 3 in the National Agreement on Closing the Gap, that is about the transformation of government organisations. And that raises questions of capability, it raises questions of leadership that I think are important. It raises questions of underpinning narratives. How do we move these questions of policy making and evaluation of policy and impact? How do we shift away from a narrative where disadvantage is the marker of indigeneity, and strength and assets become the basis of that? Simple things like maybe if we stopped measuring unemployment and started measuring employment, for example. Simple shifts of narrative like that, but there is a proverb that says, those who tell stories rule the world. It's variously attributed to either the Hopi Indians or to Plato. As an Indigenous person and a classicist, I'm reasonably comfortable with either attribution, but it underlines this singular importance of narrative in the policy-making endeavour. I think there's a challenge it's listed in the topics, to shift away from singular models of analysis and get some methodological breadth, and particularly analytical lenses that have their roots in Indigenous knowledges and insights. Because there is a fundamental difference, I'm sure, well, at least for me, there's a fundamental difference between data, evidence and knowledge. And knowledge is the creation, the end product, if you like, of our interpretation of data and evidence. And so the lenses that we use to determine if something is working or if something isn't working, to determine whether a question is worth asking or not worth asking, and to determine whether knowledge is valuable and evidentiary or whether it isn't, are fundamentally important questions for us. And so for us at IATSIS, coming to this question, and most of them, those are things that animate, they're kind of pillars, if you like, that animate our approach to the work that we do, both as a cultural organisation, but also as a national institution, speaking to our national story and our national identity. So I'm going to leave it there. I'm looking forward to the rest of the discussion.
Thanks so much, Craig. And Muriel,
yeah,
it'd be great to hear from you.
Thanks, Gemma. Thank you for the opportunity, everybody, to be a part of the webinar today. I'm a Yorta Shasharang Tangarong Bunurong woman from Victoria, and I do too want to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of all the lands that we're on and acknowledge that sovereignty was never ceded. So I want to acknowledge elders past, present and emerging. I speak to you today as Chairperson of SNAKE, the National Voice for Children, and as a member of the Coalition of Peaks on the Close the Gap. In Victoria, I'm also a member of the First Peoples Assembly. I chair a number of committees, over 30, local, state and national. And across these roles, I think it's important to have Aboriginal people contribute to the design and delivery of programs and services, but also of national policy. And I'm particularly, obviously, passionate about child protection matters, early years, family violence, and more recently, and dominating their lives at the moment is Close the Gap. I'm so proud of that work. Today, I want to give you a little bit of background on the Coalition of Peaks and some more general reflections and that I think may be of interest to you. Some may know about the Coalition of Peaks. The Coalition of Peaks came together to change the way Australian governments work with our Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, organisations and communities on closing the gap. We know that there's no doubt about the original Close the Gap policy agreed in 2008 by the Council of Australian Governments. It was a significant achievement back then. Unfortunately, that strategy was only partially implemented in some areas and stopped in others. Efforts from government to work together fell away and long-term funding of programs and services was not guaranteed. Governance was not strong. There was no really ongoing commitment to involve communities. It was based basically on their own representation in their own decisions on targets, how they would be achieved without local communities. This meant that progress on closing the gap in life outcomes has been disappointing. Too many of our Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people continue to face poor life outcomes and are not getting the support they need. In December of 2016, the COAG announced the refresh of Closing the Gap, and they said they wanted to work in genuine partnership with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, determining a new framework. However, it quickly became clear that governments were not listening properly nor engaging in a general way. And as the government looked to finalise this refresh, it was clear that the process had been rushed, limited new options that have been considered. Most importantly, there was little information on what it was and what wasn't working. Most importantly, we needed to see that our voices were truly being heard. There was a real concern that governments had already decided what they wanted to do and were negotiating behind closed doors, lacking any engagement with Aboriginal people and Torres Strait Islander people. In October 2018, a group of 14 Aboriginal community-controlled peak organisations came together and over the next 2 months made several approaches to the Prime Minister. This was ably led by Pat Turner. We met with the Prime Minister, Premiers and Chief Ministers to insist that COAG not agree any changes to closing the gap without formal input and support from Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities. We eventually gained a commitment from the Prime Minister that we should have ownership and share in the decision-making on closing the gap. This was agreed to at COAG and was the beginning of the Coalition of Peaks and the partnership agreement on closing the gap. We say it's important to understand that the partnership between our organisations came from Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. We developed a formal agreement to work together. The Coalition of Peaks drove the development of an overarching agreement on how this partnership would work, and agreement from government parties in March of 2019. The partnership agreement means that for the first time, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, through their community control peak organisations and members, are sharing decisions with governments, both states, territories and Commonwealth, on closing the gap under a formal arrangement. The partnership agreement is based on the shared understanding of Australian governments and the Coalition of Peaks that when Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people are included and have a real say in the design and delivery of services that impact on, the outcomes are far better. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people need to be at the centre of closing the gap policy. The gap will not close without our full involvement. Australian governments cannot expect our people to take charge of our own lives or to work constructively with them if we are excluded from decision making. Through these partnership arrangements, the new agreement for closing the gap was negotiated. That under the partnership agreement, the Coalition of Peaks sat down with Australian governments and looked at what had and had not been working in Close the Gap over the last 10 years. What things could be strengthened, what was missing and what needed to be changed. On the 3rd of July 2020, the Joint Council comprising of all governments and the Coalition of Peaks met to discuss the final draft on the National Agreement on Closing the Gap. It is the first national agreement of its kind. It has been developed in genuine partnership with the Coalition of Peaks and Australian governments. The national agreement was informed by a comprehensive engagement process in late 2019, led by the Coalition of Peaks with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people across the country on what would be included. We had more than 4,000 people and organisations participate. The national agreement sets out the strategy to close the gap that is strongly based on and underpinned by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people's priorities. It is built around 4 priority reform pillars about transforming the way governments work with and for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people to improve outcomes. The priority reforms were overwhelmingly supported during the engagements. These reforms are developing and strengthening, and I know that Craig spoke a little bit to them, developing and strengthening structures to ensure full involvement of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in shared decision, making the national, state and local or regional levels be able to be involved and embedding their ownership, responsibility and expertise to close the gap. The second priority reform area, building the formal Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander community control services sector to deliver closing the gap services and programs. The third one, which Craig spoke to, was ensuring all mainstream government agencies and institutions undertake systemic and structural transformation to contribute to closing the gap, improve accountability and respond to the needs of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. The last one is ensuring Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people have access to and capability to use locally relevant data and information and monitor the implementation of the priority reforms, the closing the gap targets and drive local priorities. The national agreement includes commitments to tangible actions from all governments to change the way they work with our Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people and give effect to the 4 priority reforms. Each priority reform has a target to measure government action in each of these areas. The national agreement also establishes 17 national socio-economic targets in areas including education, employment, health, wellbeing, justice, safety, housing, land and waters, and language. And the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander languages are high on that. The targets will help to monitor progress in improving the lives of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. There are new engagement and accountability mechanisms, and I know that we've been speaking and we're really proud, Romley, of the work that you're doing at the Productivity Commission. But this means that the national agreement will mean that jurisdictions will work in partnership with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people to implement the agreement, and that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people will have an ongoing say in how the national agreement is working for them. The first of the implementation plans for each jurisdiction and the Commonwealth were made public in August this year. So that is the story of the Coalition of Peaks so far. In my other roles at the Victorian level, we have also invested in building the Aboriginal evidence base, including through increasing our research and evaluation capacity. I think this is something that needs to happen across our nation. We cannot leave it to high-level government to do that. Through significant back-of-house investment, but also in our cultural practice. All of these are underpinned, everything that we do is underpinned by data. We now look at the Productivity Commission modelling on closing the gap targets, and I think this is a role for all of us. This is one of many roles that I believe that the Commission can play that gives Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander organisation communities the data to shape policy direction, get better evidence, and to drive outcomes. I acknowledge the critical work of both Romilly and Craig and the work that and how they contribute to the collaborative effort of us delivering on real outcomes. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Muriel. We're going to shift to the panel discussion. So I think we've got the whole panel up just about. Look, I might kick off with, there are so many things that have come up that make me want to go well beyond all of the areas that I sent you for our panel discussion. But I feel like we're very much in this late capitalist paradigm and moment at the moment, you know, where our worth is so defined by our engagement with the labour market. And certainly in Australia, you know, we saw that play out more than ever in the way that the COVID kind of economic response was structured. So I'm wondering if the panel has some reflections on, you know, how we push back against that and embrace different models of analysis, whether that's for policy or evaluation. I might start with you, Ganesh, because you kind of touched on this when you talked about efforts to refocus on well-being, which is something, you know, certainly in Australia, we haven't cracked that. So I might pass to you first.
Yeah, I think it's a difficult one. I do think we have to think carefully about how we recognise contributions to community, to society, to, for want of a better phrase, the economy. And I'm one of these ones who is concerned whenever, or actually quite annoyed when people talk about the economy in a very narrow perspective, adopting it, and basically they're talking about business and profitability, when actually that economy is very broad and it's all got to do with our collective resources that we have available to us, our people, our lands, our knowledge, and all of the things that we've had, and so I suppose the contribution needs to be measured, as you rightly say, beyond the labour market. And I suppose I just trying to remember about 3-4 years ago, I was on government committee welfare advisory group looking at welfare policy, and we were thinking about you contribute as long as you're either earning, learning, caring, or volunteering. And those were your sort of four dimensions through which you could contribute, for want of a better phrase, to society, to community, to the economy. And it's looking at it from that broader perspective rather than just saying, well, unless you're earning in paid employment, you're not contributing. And I was trying to get away from this idea that because you were receiving a welfare benefit, you weren't somehow contributing, you were somehow a burden, when actually you could be doing any or all of those four things and still contributing. And so that's the perspective. And I know one of our writers here, an ex-minister, in fact, Marilyn Waring, Dr. Marilyn Waring, she is now quite scathingly about the measure of GDP and how and what it excludes. And I'm talking as an economist, and I know it's boring, but just recognising just how narrow that measure, that GDP measure is, and how it, as you know, how it excludes people who stay at home and look after their children or look after their grandparents, and those sorts of things that we somehow need to recognise that they're important. They're not only important, but we need to value them if the economy is going to function, for want of a better phrase. And I think that broadening is important. You mentioned about labour market. I think the one critical thing that our old economic models have yet to understand is that we're not all individuals. We actually operate as communities. We actually operate as groups of people, whether it's in our families or our extended families, our whānau, as Māori would say, or our communities. And without those support mechanisms around all of those groups, our individual economic model falls apart.
I wondered if you had reflections on this, because you must be very actively dealing with that tension, working the Productivity Commission, because it's right there in the word productivity.
Yeah, look, I'm not an economist, nor a labour economist, so I'm shaky ground when it comes to rigorous economic analysis. But what I do know is that the Commission itself has had to deal with commissions coming from government that are much more in the social policy domain and human services domain. So this is, we might think, well, government will seek to have certain questions explored and policy options given, but it's actually signalling that economic analysis is important, but not the only game in town. And in a sense, for me, I mean, I came directly into this position with a very clear view in my mind that I was here to contribute to doing the best for outcomes for our mob. Now, there's language that might be used around whether you're coming in with a bias or priors, or somehow, there's a lack of independence. And I'm very interested in those notions of what is valued, what is not valued. So how does experience come to bear? And particularly in the world that we're in right now, Ganesh, you talked about how measurement is individualised, and how Indigenous people, we're a part of communities, families, communities, connectivity. The strength of that connectivity, while perhaps not measured in national data sets, doesn't mean that it's not valued. And I think a lot of non-Indigenous people are actually looking to Indigenous people and the ways in which we connect, support each other, not only simply in place, in proximity, but across time. We are connected directly right here and now. Muriel, Craig and I are directly connected to our ancestors. We have responsibilities in the present, and we have obligations for the future. Now, how one might understand that against a set of metrics is an interesting question. So while there may be some tension, Gemma, it's really, for me, my interest always is explorative and bringing these two knowledge systems together, recognising the dominance of one over the other.
Muriel, Craig, I wanted to give you the opportunity for reflections on this discussion as well.
I'll go after Muriel.
Yeah, look, I guess running an Aboriginal organisation where we deliver camps, we do a lot of things, genealogies, return to country, but they don't meet the threshold often of evidence about what works and what is Aboriginal ways of doing and being, and are focused on well-being. And I think quite often People don't see the importance of well-being, and it doesn't get measured. Language and the importance of language, the importance of ceremony, they don't come in, into an evidence base that anybody actually measures, but they're critical for us in the Aboriginal space around, and they measure how well the well-being of Aboriginal people. And I think no one ever asks us for that evidence. And so what we need to do is build our own Aboriginal evidence base. But how does it meet the threshold for evidence to get onto an Aboriginal menu of evidence? And so how do we build an Aboriginal evidence base? And so I think we struggle, and then as a consequence, we don't actually, we all deliver Aboriginal programs across the Aboriginal community control sector. What is Aboriginal? And so when we get to look at reporting and evaluations, they only see the Western construct of what we deliver, of the programs, of the services. They don't actually see, and they don't even try and understand what is Aboriginal about our programs. What do we do that's culturally different, that's engaging, that's in assessing in our practice frameworks, in our Aboriginal theoretical frameworks, in what we do that's different, and how do we engage, and you wonder why you don't see broader outcomes, because no one actually looks at what it is. It's the Aboriginal, what we need as from a mainstream service system. Thanks. Sorry, Craig.
No, but that's brilliant. I really like that. I think for me, both my colleagues have touched on a number of these things. The first of them for me is this question of narrative and asking the question of where do we live? I think that we've lost sight of, and I think the pandemic has given us an opportunity to discover how much we may have lost sight of the fact that we don't live in economies. We live in societies within which economic relations take place. That narrative perspective makes all of the difference, because a society is about people and how they relate to one another, how they, across all dimensions of life, including the economic. And so I think that if we can even start to conceptualize what a post-pandemic world might look like, that fundamental appreciation that we as Indigenous people have known all the time, it's why we ask the question, who's your mom? When we meet one another, it's because we as individuals live within a social context that Romley, I think, described beautifully, with connections to our ancestors, responsibilities in the present and obligations to the future. And so I think there is, how do we shift? Gemma, I think was the question you asked. I think we need to continually assert that narrative and tell that story that we live in societies within which we do a bunch of things, including have economic exchanges and relationships. The second thing for me is this question of perspectives. I've got to say, quite a devotee of an old book now, but it's quite contemporary when you read it, called Seeing Like a State by James Scott. If you haven't read it, you're missing out. And where he describes the way that a state looks at complexity, looks at challenges, looks at things, and tries to create legibility by imposing a particular knowledge regime, a particular way of thinking about things to reduce complexity and create legibility. And the example that he uses was the transformation of a forest from being a phenomenon of nature to being a place of natural resources. And it's about how you look at something, right? And to do that, you have to exclude completely the perspective of people who live in the forest and for whom it's not a collection of natural resources to be exploited and to be harvested, but it's a place where they live. Or the perspective of I'm trying to struggle for the discipline, but someone who studies the environment and thinks of a forest as an ecosystem, and you end up creating, as he describes this pretty neatly, these monocrop forests designed to maximize the production of timber. Like, you know, those things you see, they're all the same trees and they're all in straight lines. They're easy for people to get to, they're easy to exploit, but they lack everything that makes a forest work. They lack everything that makes the trees grow. Different species interacting, different people living in, all these kind of things. And so this idea that I think we have to actively incorporate different perspectives, particularly the perspectives and the insights of the excluded. Because he described in that particular book that the yield from these forests went up significantly to begin with, but declined over time when they suddenly realized they didn't have all of the leaf litter that was creating the fertile soils and all the stuff that made trees grow. And so I think that perspectives of the excluded, and if there's any, there's a lot to be said for the refreshed closing the gap framework and Muriel articulated it really beautifully before. But chief, I think, for me, is that it creates a framework for the reincorporation of perspectives that have been excluded, but that are critical to making our societies work. And as Romney said, not just Indigenous societies, but this nation and the societies that make up this nation. And indeed, I think we're learning through the pandemic that we've lost globally. So.
I think that was beautifully put. We live in communities in which economic interactions take place rather than we live in an economy, which is, I think too often that gets lost in political discourse at the moment. So if we go back to what we measure matters, which is sort of has bubbled up from everybody, I think, to be provocative, if you could throw away, say, 3 to 5 measures and bring in some new ones, what would they be? I might start with you, Muriel.
I think for me, I guess, I think we've got to learn from New Zealand around language immersion, and how that improved, particularly in Canada when there was a reinvestment in language and looking at what the flow-on effect from language, because language immersion just improved many outcomes. And I know that it sounds quite simple, but it actually, for me, has many impacts for children, for parents. We found that when New Zealand started to teach language in the schools, then they went home to parents, and then parents started to learn. And it had a flow-on effect because it was around cultural immersion. That Maori people started to learn more and practice. It's a little bit more simpler, obviously, in New Zealand than Australia because of all the languages that we have. But certainly we're seeing a lot more language immersion. You go on the plains now and they acknowledge traditional lands when you fly into different parts of Australia. You can see the markings, and for me, language immersion is critical. But if from what we see as the Coalition of Peaks, I think what we've seen is that strong partnership and being able to measure government, but being able to measure things that matter on the ground. I think a lot of governments, as I said, don't measure anything Aboriginal, and then they wonder why we're not getting anywhere with regard to outcomes. So it is around domains of culture. How does culture impact on children, language? We're looking at the treaty process in Victoria, and we're very much looking at how do we embed nationhood rights as well as civil service rights. And so what are our civil service rights before a system that, and how do we pursue that? Because we know we've got many policies, we've got many commitments by government, but nobody delivers on it. And so how do we actually get stronger deliverables out of the commitments that we already write out of our agreement? So how do we have stronger governance of our own commitments? And so I think through Close the Gap, being able to have stronger governance and stronger being able to, hold governments to account is really critical. And I think that the work that we're doing with Romley at the moment to look at how do we actually build in stronger accountabilities, I think, across government, across services. But, I think if we can't get mainstream to the table, if we aren't able to hold mainstream accountable for outcomes, at the moment, I worry that most of the outcomes for Aboriginal are with Aboriginal and that we're the only ones reporting on, and we only get a small percentage of the resources, and most of the accountabilities are with government and mainstream, but there's no accountabilities. Mainstream don't have to deliver on what they do, and they get the same bucket of money even when they underperform. So how do we hold mainstream more accountable?
You look like you want to jump in.
Yeah, I think all of that's great, Muriel. As I'm reflecting on the question, I'm kind of not tempted to kind of identify specific measures and throw them off to the side and incorporate others. But the points that I would make really pick up on Craig's point about the narrative. And I'm just contemplating it or reflecting at this point in time on some of the work that our colleague, Professor Maggie Walter, has done. And Maggie's, she's very clever at alliteration, and she has framed the way in which data and cheekily talking about the statistical indigeny and how data is, and she calls it 5D data. So the kind of data that we look at for Indigenous people, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in this country, are largely constrained or contained within these 5Ds. Disparity, deprivation, disadvantage, dysfunction, and difference. So of those 5, you think, okay, maybe difference is, we can work with, but the rest of it actually frames Aboriginal people, Torres Strait Islander people within that discourse, that deficit discourse. And we have statistical collections that will continue to reproduce that. And this was a part of the issue that was identified with a lot of our people, a lot of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, when we did a big engagement, a review of the Overcoming Indigenous Disadvantage report when I first started. So again, the framing of the disadvantage, recognising government history and in where it came from and where it got to, but it's this narrative. It's the reproduction of the narrative and what sits below it. The other thing that Maggie talks about is how easy it is then to have this sort of deficit data framing Indigenous people as problematic people. So she talks about this deficit data, problematic people correlation. And where we land on that is that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people own the problem. They are the problem and they own the problem. The problem sits at their feet, rather than dealing with the sort of ongoing structural issues that we have to tackle. So reluctant to pick off, specific measures, but more a commentary on where we've got to and how that narrative, based on the data that we have, continues to reproduce the things that we've seen for a long time.
Oh, can I just pick that up? Because and the other thing, quite apart from the shedding home responsibility for the problem and its solution alone to Indigenous people, it encourages a resort to oversimplification. If I'm critical of the original Close the Gap framework, although remarkable in its day, but singularly lacking in engagement with us as First Nations people about what we thought the problem might be. It really also signalled that the best that government could do for us was the reduction in child mortality by half, right, over a long period of time, for example. And I'm with Rom. I'm reluctant to abandon or chuck out targets, but I think the challenge for those of us, you know, and I'm conscious I'm a public servant, so I work within that framework. The challenge for us is to engage with complexity. For example, is it possible for us to move beyond a simple metric of life expectancy in terms of number of years extra lived, and think about, well, what kind of years are they going to be? What's the quality of those additional years like? And that's really complex, because you then have to engage with people to ask, well, what constitutes a good life? And to go back to the phrase that Muriel used, what particularly constitutes a good life for an Aboriginal person? What is it that we think is a good and a life worth living, to borrow Amartya Sen's, probably bastardise his phrase a little bit. And so I think the challenge is to further develop some of the measures, and I use that life expectancy one as one in particular. I do want to live a long life, but I want to live a long, good life. I'm reminded of years ago working with people around dialysis in Aboriginal health, and the fact that state health officials and Commonwealth health officials, non-Indigenous ones, were completely flummoxed by the unwillingness of people from the Kimberley to move to Perth in order to get dialysis, because the thing they valued about life was living on their country and living with their families and in their communities, not just living extra years. And so they made decisions, rational decisions, that because those things mattered, moving to Perth to move away from family, to live off country because you needed to dialyse 3 times a week, wasn't a choice that they were prepared to make. And so that became really problematic for health systems then to know, how the hell do we respond to that? I would have thought relatively easy. You create dialysis in the Kimberley, but so I think engaging with these questions about what constitutes a good life, what constitutes things. You know, another example I would give is this: in education, is just a straight focus on school attendance, without asking questions about, is the school worth going to? Is the education that the school provides worth getting? And this comes back to Muriel's point about languages and the value of languages, both in terms of the personal, the value of language to individuals. I'm 55 now, but when I started at IATSIS, I was 51 years old. And it was the first time I had the opportunity to learn to speak Dunghutti. And then only because I had the good luck to be in an institution that employed a linguist that worked on our dictionary. Sheer good luck. Now, my objective for my grandchildren is that they don't have to wait till they're in their 50s before they engage with our language. They're in a position to be able to do that. So the target around languages is great, but it also has a practical outcome. And I point to the Maori immersion schools, and this, I think, what I hear anyway, stand to be corrected, is superior educational outcomes from students who go to school in Maori immersion schools, really countering that narrative that the only way to succeed educationally in countries like ours is in English. And so I think the challenge for us, Gemma, is a greater sophistication and a willingness to engage with those tough conversations rather than resort to simple metrics that are the best we can do without trying.
Thanks, Craig. Ganesh, did you have some reflections from Aotearoa on
I suppose just picking up on the conversation across both Ron and Muriel and Craig, I think the measures are important, but I think we've got to be a bit cleverer. And as I say, we're very good at getting individual measures, but we've really got to start thinking about measuring the strength of communities. And it's picking up on the point before about connections. And we've got to actually start thinking about, for example, a positive measure about how well connected is your community, both your community with other communities, but internally as well, in terms of how well connected are you? What are those measures of connections, the strengths of connections, the strengths of those, what I sort of use community infrastructure that we have, that we build up around us, many take for granted, but there are those measures. It's getting away from those individualistic measures, which we're very good at connecting, but actually start thinking about how do we measure the strength of a community? Because if that's what we're talking about in terms of our desire to set the platform for future generations, it's those strengths of communities that's going to endure. I suppose the other element around a language is important, and absolutely it's the narrative around the positive stories, the narrative that Te Reo Māori is a living, vibrant language and is usable across various dimensions. And the other one that I would just throw in terms of the narrative, and it's a bit of a challenge to people like me in the public sector, is when, and it struck me quite hard when I was out a few months ago in terms of an engagement process around engaging in terms of our persistent disadvantage inquiry and what are the types of measures we might like to use. And the pushback or the conversation came back to us quite strongly from some groups in the disadvantage was, stop trying to fix us. We are not broken. And that's the narrative that we've got to get to within the public service in terms of all of our policy models, which is around intervening in the lives of individuals to make them better or to fix them. Well, actually, we've got to turn that around and actually say, well, maybe they're not fixed. They're not the ones who are broken. Maybe they're not the ones who need fixing. It's, reflecting back on us, it's the systems that we are forcing people to live in. It's the systems we're forcing people to, or the rules that we're forcing them to abide by that may not be appropriate for their needs. It's just, it's that narrative that we've got to actually make a lot more, challenging and a lot more acceptable for us to actually engage in that narrative, rather than the standard one, which is we'll measure whether you've gone to school and whether you've got a job and what's your income. Is there a health service that you can access, and if you don't get it, that's your fault because you didn't go and get it, and those sorts of things. Because those measures are great, but it's continuing that deficit measure, but also that I suppose telling individuals that it's their problem and it's up to them to sort their lives out, as opposed to us. Us as part of the state, we're the ones with the power. It's actually up to us to sort it out, not treat them as broken and trying to fix them.
It's telling me I have to wrap up. I'm going to be sneaky and put one more question to you all, which is where does data custodianship sort of sit in this conversation? Rom, you look ready to speak.
So we are winding up, aren't we? We've got a big question there. Look, I'm interested in. I know that these have been active conversations for some time, and there are a range of views broadly as well as within our own community. But my reflection on data sovereignty really is that the word sovereignty, frightens the hell out of people. And so there's a kind of a disengagement even in the discussion before the discussion has been had. So I'm very alive to the fact that the negotiation around the Closing the Gap agreement speaks to these issues, and the architecture of Closing the Gap therefore requires parties to the agreement to come together for a conversation. I think that's a good thing, rather than, perhaps 5 years ago, certainly when I was heading up the Lowitja Institute, the conversations that we were having as Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people were non-contentious. It was the conversations that were had by others that were difficult. So we've got an architecture now in a national agreement, all governments, community control sector, and I think that's a really good thing. So I might just leave it at that.
Years ago, if I can just, oh, sorry, Mira, did I talk over you?
No, you go.
So years ago, when I worked for the ACT government, I was part of a group that had the worst acronym in the world, NAGATSAHID. It's the National Advisory Group on Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Health Information and Data. And Romney's right, the word sovereignty does frighten people, but not the issue, because I remember one of the things as a territory official that we were, all of the states and territories were absolutely united in this one goal, and that is that the Commonwealth would not unilaterally control and interpret information about what was going on in state and territory health systems in relation to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. And so that was built into the way that committee worked. It was built into the way the AOHW produced its biannual report on the health and welfare of Indigenous people. That is the idea that information belonged, in this case, it belonged to the states and territories, and the states and territories were not going to allow somebody else external to them to interpret and try and make sense and, in a sense, control how that data was used and therefore understood. Very simple. Everybody bought into that. Somehow or other, when the proposition is that Indigenous people have a right to not only control the questions that are asked, but control how that information is understood, how that information is interpreted, and how that information and data is used, somehow or other we lose our ability to function like rational human beings. And so I think the issue of data sovereignty is not a foreign issue to governments, because the 9 Australian governments have thought about this for many, many years. It's just the challenge that is presented by what people think the word sovereignty means, and frankly, its application in this context that treats Indigenous people as agents and active rather than passive recipients of what it is that governments decide to do. And so I think it's central to it, because all data is interpreted to create knowledge. That requires lenses, it requires ways of seeing things, it requires ways of looking at things. And it comes back to that fundamental proposition that we need to bring Indigenous people back into the driver's seat, preferably, or at least to the table. Yeah, my response is that.
Miriam, did you want to wrap up
just very quickly,
chat for us?
I think it's a very hot topic for Aboriginal people. I mean, we're looking at it at the Close the Gap at the Commonwealth level, but also in the Treaty Assembly about what data sovereignty looks like. And I think there's various protocols. I think agreements, more awareness now for Aboriginal people. I think a lot of Aboriginal people now are asking, well, what do you want that information for? And I think, I think we're starting to query and look at authority and the authorising environment. But, it's about our people understanding their rights and, the protections that they have for their data being used. But it gets mixed up as well with intellectual property. I think that what we find is that we know that we're the most researched and we give up data, but it's not the data that we want to give up that gets measured. Often it's, people take us as our dysfunction and, how badly we are doing. And I think what we find is often the data are lazy. They just want the onus to be, particularly on the Aboriginal people, for us to capture the evidence, and then they come to us and want that real, rich information. And then when they take it away, they filter what they use it. And so it's not they're not giving the narrative that often is in an Aboriginal community controlled organisation. And like, if you think of most of our ACCOs and ACCHOs, they deliver a multitude of services, but you'll get one data point coming in and understanding their health, and then you'll have someone else come in and find out their child protection, someone else come in and look at their early years, never really understand that most of the Aboriginal community controlled organisations deliver on a number of areas, and look at our combined capacity to deliver really good services across a number of domains. But data, just comes in and looks at one element. And I think that then doesn't really understand how the community is, the ecological and the individual results that our Aboriginal organisations are delivering. And quite often, as I said, we're found wanting. But can I just touch on the one thing that we found under COVID was digital poverty? And I honestly, we do need to understand digital poverty and how that impacts. It's now on the UN indicator of one of the areas of disadvantage. But if you think about when we hit COVID in Victoria, a lot of our children didn't have a computer in the home, didn't have technology. How do you do your homework? How do how do people access systems? And so I think if we don't really think about the impact of digital poverty, I think we miss a really area of great disadvantage and poverty for Aboriginal people. Thank you.
Thanks, Mira. Yes, CSI Swinburne actually does the Digital Inclusion Index that's done annually, where that shows up quite strongly as well. I think we could have run this as a half-day workshop, not as an hour and a bit panel, but thank you for everyone for coming. Thank you for all of our speakers. It's been fascinating. I think, there's one thing, there's so many things to take away, but one in particular, as a non-Indigenous person, is that the more that we fail to do this kind of restructuring, reframing of conversations, we all suffer. Actually, as a result of that as well. So thank you for giving up your time today to take part in this CSI webinar.